Hi everybody, and welcome to this revision video which covers the schedules of reinforcement in operant conditioning as part of this psychology of learning topic for stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. So it's important to consider when positive reinforcement is given or administered and its impact on subsequent behaviours in operant conditioning. This refers to the schedules of reinforcement. So there are actually 5 schedules of reinforcement that we're going to cover in this video. Continuous, fixed interval, fixed ratio, variable interval, and variable ratio. Let's start with continuous reinforcement. So this is receiving reinforcement for every single behaviour. Using this schedule, learning happens very, very quickly. So, for example, if you're training your new puppy to sit, which is also shaping, you will need to give her a treat every time she sits. But this is not an everyday occurrence, so once your puppy grows up to be an adult dog, you won't need to obviously reinforce them every time she sits. So continuous reinforcement is not an everyday occurrence to increase behaviours. Once a new behaviour has been learned, there is no need to continue reinforcing it. So you're likely not to still be rewarded for the behaviour of using the bathroom like you were when you were toilet trained as a child. So partial reinforcement is much more common. And this occurs when only some of the desired behaviours are reinforced. Let's now look at the partial schedules of reinforcement. Sometimes these are also called intermittent schedules of reinforcement. The first one of these is fixed interval. So fixed interval is when the reinforcement is delivered at a predictable time. So fixed means set and interval relates to time. So we are reinforced after a set time has passed. As long as the behaviour is performed at least once, the subject will receive the reinforcement. A very good example of this is salaried workers. They often get paid once a fortnight on the same day and sometimes the same time, no matter how hard they actually work. So the reinforcement is not dependent on their behaviour, but dependent on the time that passes. Another example is when your supervisor walks past your desk every hour. So it's a set time, it's a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement that occurs. Now variable interval is a little bit different. So interval still relates to time, but variable means it's unknown. So it's an unknown time that someone will get reinforced, if at all. So variable interval is when the reinforcement is delivered at an unpredictable time, and it might not be at all, like I said. So an example is fishing. A person fishing cannot predict when they will catch a fish. It doesn't depend on the repetition of their behaviour. It depends on how long they actually stay outside fishing for. So they may catch a fish after 5 minutes, or they could be out there for 8 hours and catch nothing. Another very good example of variable interval is checking social media for notifications. You have no control of when you're going to get an Instagram or TikTok or Facebook notification. It depends on the time that passes. So it's an unknown time that you will get reinforced. Now, fixed ratio depends on responses. So fixed is set, as we know, but ratio relates to responses or behaviours. So fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement is when the reinforcement is delivered after a predictable number of responses. So set responses, in other words. This depends on the number or ratio of responses being completed before receiving the reward. So for example, a fruit picker receives payment if they fill up 10 buckets. So they must complete the behaviour of filling up 10 buckets before they actually get reinforced. It doesn't depend on time like the interval schedules. It may take them 10 minutes, it may take them 10 hours. That doesn't matter. The actual ratio of behaviours is what's going to depend on them getting rewarded, not the time that passes. Loyalty schemes work on this schedule of reinforcement. Any sort of loyalty card for a coffee shop or takeaway place uses fixed ratio schedules. So for example, buy 5 coffees, get the 6th one free. The customer has to buy the coffees in order to get the reinforcement of the 6th one free. Again, this is not dependent on time, but the responses or behaviours of them buying the coffees. So they may have the loyalty card for 6 months before they get the reinforcer, or they may have it only after a week. The time is irrelevant. The only way they're going to get reinforced is if they do the set number of behaviours, which is buying the 5 coffees. Now, variable ratio is the last partial stage of reinforcement. So variable ratio is when the reinforcement is delivered after an unpredictable amount of responses are made. The best example of a variable ratio schedule is gambling, specifically poker machines. So people press a button and may or may not get reinforced after an unpredictable amount of presses. So because it's variable, it's unknown. So we have to make an unknown amount of behaviors if or when we get reinforced at all. A sales pitch is also an example of variable ratio. The more people you pitch to, the more likely you will get a sale, but that's not guaranteed. This schedule is used in all forms of gambling, which is why it is so addictive and is the most difficult reinforcement schedule to extinguish. So here's some helpful hints for you. Interval relates to time, ratio relates to responses or behaviors. Fixed means it's set or predictable. Variable means it's unknown or unpredictable. So how do the schedules of reinforcement affect learning, extinction, and performance? B.F. Skinner, who we've talked about in a previous video, spent much of his research career experimenting and observing which reinforcement schedules influence the rates of learning in rats and pigeons. He discovered that each of the schedules of reinforcement influenced how quickly an animal was able to learn a new behavior, the impact on the continued performance of that behavior, and how quickly the behavior became extinct once the reinforcement was stopped. This is summarized in this table here. On the left, we have each schedule of reinforcement. We have a description of said schedule. We have the learning that occurs, the performance, and of course the extinction rates. Let's talk about this in more detail. So continuous reinforcement, again, is rewarding the behavior continuously each time the correct behavior is performed. So learning is very fast, and this schedule is best used when learning something new. Animals and people respond very well. Performance may depend or become dependent on the reward being present. High rates of the response as each response is rewarded. So in other words, the performance or the learning happens very, very quickly. But just like the behavior is learned quickly, extinction is also very, very fast. So we're more likely to become extinct once the reward stops. So we learn a behavior quickly, but then it can go away quickly. Fixed interval schedule is set time. So we are reinforced after a set time, as previously discussed. So once the interval is learnt, performance will drop off until the next time the interval approaches. Another good example of this is students don't study until the night before the next test. There's a moderate response rate, but there is no incentive to perform the behavior between the rewards, or between the tests, for example. The behavior increases as the next time interval approaches. So the resistance to extinction increases, the interval lengthens in time. However, it's likely to become extinct quite quickly with no reinforcer. Variable interval, as we've said before, is unknown time to get reinforced. This is useful for teachers to keep students studying on a regular basis, as they may not know when they are going to be tested next. So surprise quizzes are an example of this. It's moderate yet steady response rate in terms of performance, because we don't know when the reinforcer will come, but it's worth it to keep checking. So the behavior remains steady. It's more resistant to extinction because of this than the fixed interval schedule, as long as the intervals are similar. Fixed ratio is set number of behaviors, as discussed before. This is useful when learning something new, but you don't want to reinforce every correct behavior. It's got a high response rate with pauses after reinforcement, but extinction is reached quickly when all the reinforcement is taken away. So in other words, when someone fills up 10 buckets of apples, like in my previous example, they won't want to continue the behavior, so extinction happens quite rapidly. Variable ratio is unknown responses that need to be made before reinforcement is given. This is useful once a behavior has already been learnt. A variable ratio schedule is the best way to maintain behavior or keep it going. It's got a high and steady response rate, and it's very, very addictive and resistant to extinction, which explains why people have a compulsion to gamble, because it depends on them continuing the behavior over and over again if they're going to get reinforced at all.